Initially, our next speaker was to be Dr. Lorraine Nicol. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, she was unable to attend today. We are grateful that Michelle Konschuh has stepped in to provide an alternate presentation as a replacement. Thank you. Michelle is going to speak to us about more crop per drop, strategies to manage a reduced irrigation water allocation. Michelle Konschuh is a research scientist with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry based in Lethbridge. Michelle earned a PhD from the University of Calgary in 1995, studying developmental plant physiology in the Biological Sciences Department. She worked on potato-related projects for AF for 20 years in Brooks. Michelle now works with the Irrigation Management section and focuses on irrigated crop research to foster increased irrigation efficiency while maintaining production. Michelle.
Hi, so I'm pleased to be here. It's the first time addressing this group. It is the second time giving this presentation, so I will apologize to those of you who have heard it already. And I do want to I guess, humbly admit that these are strategies when we're looking for what you can do with a reduced water allocation. I have to admit I am neither an irrigator nor a producer. So these are things that I've gleaned from the literature, from discussions with others and things like that. So I understand there's a lot of people in this room who probably have a lot more experience on how to get the best, how to eke the best economic return out of reduced water allocations. But these are some of the ideas that we pulled forward. And so I want to acknowledge that we get snowpack forecasts from Alberta Environment and Parks, and it looks this year as though we're sitting pretty. So as of recent forecasts, it looks like we're kind of on average or perhaps above average for snowpack in a lot of parts of the province. However, last year and in other years, some of the irrigation districts have had to impose an allocation restriction at the beginning of the season. We were grateful then to see some rain during the season, and the restrictions were sometimes alleviated partway through. But as we get potential climate change, perhaps we're going to get drier seasons, a little bit more pressure from other water users on what happens with that water, there's always an incentive to become more efficient with the water that we're provided with. So I want to talk about four main strategies. I will talk a little bit on each of these. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the irrigation management piece. That's where I work now, and it's work that we've had a little bit more firsthand experience with. In terms of irrigation systems, though, obviously if you have a reduced water allocation and you're heading into the season, you definitely want to make sure that the water that you're purchasing or the water you've been allocated gets where it needs to get. So you want to make sure that your system maintenance is up to date. For sprinkler irrigation systems, that's going to mean that you're reducing losses. You want to replace worn sprinklers, self-levelers if you have a wheel move system. You want to make sure your drains and gaskets are good and that you fixed all the leaks so the water gets where it's intended to go. For surface irrigators, it might be time to consider releveling or to evaluate your furrow and border flow rates to improve your set times and increase efficiencies. Better yet, when your water allocations are restricted, it might be an incentive or an impetus to upgrade your irrigation systems. So if it's feasible, upgrading from a wheel move to a pivot irrigation can increase your efficiency, your water use efficiency, by up to 15%. And right now the government does have a program called the Irrigation Efficiency Program that will assist producers with a portion of those costs. Always best management practices are important for producers in terms of getting the best economic outcome. Some of the best management practices you want to consider are things in the agronomic strategies. There are strategies like reduced tillage, residue management, altering plant populations, and actually, of course, there's people in the province who don't have the luxury of using irrigation to produce their crop, and so you can borrow some of the strategies that dryland producers use, perhaps changing your plant densities and things like that to conserve moisture and do the best you can with the amount that you've been given. Pest control is another area in best management practices that's always important. In a water restriction situation, weeds are particularly well adapted to limited water supplies, and they will outcompete your crop. So you never want to let weeds grow in your field, but in a year where your water is limited, it's even more important that you keep a handle on your weed control. And stressed crops, such as those if you have a deficit irrigation situation, are going to be a little more susceptible to diseases and pests. So it's really important that you scout often and that you address any pest issues as they come up to give your crop the best fighting chance it has. As well, with fertilization, you want to make sure that you're properly fertilizing. So if you put fertilizer on but you're not able to give it sufficient water, it's a waste of fertilizer. The plant can't use it if there isn't enough water there to make use of it. And also, if you irrigate your crop well but you under-fertilize, you're not going to get optimum returns. So you want to make sure that the fertilization is paired well with your intended water use. I want to talk a little bit about crop rotation and crop selection. Obviously, if you grow crops on contract or if you rely on the production of crops to feed your livestock, you have a little less flexibility in terms of what crops you're going to select from. But if you have some flexibilities, there's some things to consider. So good crop rotation can often increase the efficiency overall of your irrigation applications. For example, if you plant a deep-rooted crop following a shallow-rooted crop, that deep-rooted crop can use up water reserves that the shallow-rooted crop wasn't able to get to. Crop rotations can also spread out sort of peak irrigation seasons. So if there are critical times that you're paying attention to water use, you can grow crops that spread that water requirement out to make sure that you're sort of extending beyond a critical water demand period. Also with crop selection, when you have irrigation supplies, if it's a short-term irrigation reduction for perhaps just one season or even for a portion of the season, the most logical switch is to go from a crop that requires more water to one that requires less. If you're looking at annual forages crops over perennial crops, you have a shorter growing season and also perhaps greater water use efficiency. So you tend to irrigate crops or select crops on the basis of what you're set up for, your economic returns, adaptability to the area, water use, production preferences, and things like that. But crop selection can play a role if you have some flexibility there. Also, you can choose more drought-tolerant crops, and so both in cereals and with other annual crops there's kind of a list. Fall rye and spring rye are a little bit more drought-tolerant, for instance, than spring wheat or oats. So depending on what your needs are and what crops you're putting in, sometimes you can still honor a rotation, but you can choose crops that are a little bit more tolerant of a restricted water allocation. With other annual crops as well, things like pearl millet and sunflower require less water than something like corn, which is a particularly high water use crop. In terms of irrigation management, crop-specific irrigation management can improve your economic outcomes, so especially when irrigation water is limited. So obviously in a perfect world, we could replace all of the evapotranspiration of a crop. You can give it all the water that it needs and get your maximum economic return. There's a quote here from English et al. In 2002. He argues that when water supply is limited, optimum isn't the same. You're going to move the old paradigm where water was managed to achieve maximum yields will be replaced with one where water use is optimized to achieve your economic efficiency. And there's a potato researcher that often cites, that optimum yield is different if you're looking at maximizing your yield at any cost versus maximizing your yield for the best economic return. So most of the information that I'm pulling from this irrigation management section comes from the irrigation management manual that Alberta Agriculture puts out. This one is available on open data in the Alberta Agriculture website. And it has some excellent information for irrigation management principles and then some very specific crop information. So crops have growth stages that are more, where water is more critical to their yield component. And that differs a little bit with each crop. So typically that crop time frame where you need to be really paying attention to water is during reproductive growth stages. When water allocation can't meet your full evapotranspiration needs, then you should pay special attention to the times when yield is going to be most affected. And that does depend on the crop. So I've pulled a few here into a couple of tables. For alfalfa, the first column beside the crop indicates the effective root zone or the area of the field or the depth of the field that the crop can pull moisture from. And that varies crop to crop. Then there's a column, the middle column is the water requirement, and there is a range, but you can see there that there's quite a range in water demand for each of these crops. And then also the most sensitive growth stage. So for alfalfa, it's a fairly small seeded crop. It's really important that you have adequate water at the time of stand establishment. But once that crop is established, alfalfa is a little more drought tolerant or forgiving. You're not necessarily going to get great yield, but you won't lose the crop. So establishment is the time when you want to pay most attention to getting the watering right. For things like canola, barley, and wheat, you're going to pay special attention at the time of flowering. If you don't set seed in a crop where you're harvesting seed, there's nothing there to fill, so you can't fill heads of empty seeds. For silage corn, tasseling and silking is a key stage of development. For other crops, like dry bean and pea, again, it's flowering and pod fill, but you get to things like potato and sugar beet, and we don't harvest seed, and we don't pay particular attention to the time of flowering. In the case of sugar beet, emergence is really important. Each of those plants has to kind of get a foothold, and then grow in the field. If you don't have a good stand, it won't matter how big some of those sugar beets get, you're not going to get an excellent yield. With potato, it's about tuber initiation, because again, if you don't initiate the tubers, there's nothing there to bulk or harvest later. So there's some key stages of development with each crop, and it's important that you pay attention to those stages if you have to restrict water allocations. And in that irrigation management manual, we have a number of sort of standard crops, but the irrigation management section is still working on additional crops. So as new crops come along, there's work being done to determine the best time to irrigate other crops. This is an example from Harms et al. On soybean. And there's 3 bars at each of those, with each of those treatments. And the 2016 bars, which are the center bars, are very similar across all treatments, and that's because there was actually adequate moisture well into August that year. But with the outside bars, and in particular the 2017, the lightest green bars, the irrigation approach, or the irrigation management approach, made quite a difference. So the first treatment was full irrigation, and that gave excellent yield with all 3 years. And you can see that if you only irrigate to pod set, irrigate fully until pod set, or if you only irrigate from flowering to pod set in some of those outer bars, you don't get as good a yield. So the circled area is where you start at flowering and irrigate for the rest of the season. So for soybean, that's kind of the best strategy that we could give you. If you could withhold your watering until flowering, then give it full irrigation, you can cut back on your overall water usage and really not affect your yield significantly. We also have a dry bean example. This one's more about, not about reducing the overall water use, but just about getting the timing right. So in an example where they did some dry bean research, they tried monitoring the soil depth to 60 centimeters or 2 feet deep, and then irrigating kind of when that would trigger an irrigation event, or monitoring only to 30 centimeter depth or 1 foot. They split it up during the season, and then they tried light frequent irrigations versus infrequent heavier irrigations. And the outcome was that the best treatments they could give it were light frequent irrigations, and you could increase your return on a cropping situation by about $400 per acre just by getting your watering right. So it's some of the ongoing work that we do as a department is working with different crops, new crops, and trying to get the irrigation strategies right, because if you can affect your outcome by $400 per hectare simply by irrigating right, then it's worth learning how. Another irrigation management approach is to not irrigate all of your acres. So in several studies, some net returns were reduced when you irrigate all of your acres with less than adequate capacity as compared to maintaining adequate capacity on fewer acres. And in particular, I pulled an example from the Ministry of Agriculture in British Columbia, where they have a fact sheet developed for alfalfa forage. So this is a hay example. In this example, they said that irrigating a portion of the acreage fully produced as much total yield and as much return on investment then as irrigating the full acreage partially, but you also reduce some of your costs. So what that looks like is that in partial irrigation, they used 65% irrigation on 100 acres. So they reduced their yield to the 65% of your potential. So they only got 3.25 ton per acre of hay. And for easy math, we're using $100 per ton. I hope it's a little higher than that these days. And the crop return then would be $32,500. If you, instead of doing that approach, if you irrigated 65 acres fully and let your other 35 acres, left that to Mother Nature, then you would still get the same crop return, because you'd have 5 ton per acre on 65 acres or 32,500, but you have saved irrigation costs on the other part. There is still a potential that 35 acres would produce something if you got natural rainfall, or you could potentially have some value there for grazing. In terms of irrigation management, because my background was with potato for a long time, it's important to note that some crops are so expensive to grow that deficit irrigation is never going to pencil out. So when both your yield and quality are affected by irrigation management, and both yield and quality affect the value of that crop considerably, your best option will always be to irrigate those crops fully, and then reduce either the acreage of those crops or reduce your allocation on other less sensitive crops so that you can irrigate your most expensive crops best. So I guess to sum up, irrigators cannot control the availability of irrigation water, districts can, but there are other strategies that they can use to put that allocation to the best use. And so it's important that we communicate that to them so that if there is a water restricted year, the outcome for the producers is still positive. Thank you. I think there's probably time for questions, but thank you. Okay.
If you have any